What happens when a person with absolute power feels small? When a crown weighs heavy, but a personal slight feels heavier. Is a queen, surrounded by servants and protocol, one of the loneliest people on earth, left to fixate on rivals in a gilded cage? The history books tell us about their wars, their treaties, their heirs, but they don't always tell us about the time a queen used a garden to get revenge, or when the choice of a dress was a declaration of war, or when refusing to speak a name was a lifelong battle. Number 19 was a diamond ring. Really? That vulgar? Princess Margaret was the sister of a queen. She was not the queen herself. This detail is important. She had the status, but not the ultimate power. Elizabeth Taylor was Hollywood royalty. She was a queen of the silver screen, adored by millions. She had fame and immense wealth, but not the ancient status of a princess. The two women moved in similar circles. They attended the same parties, they knew the same people, and they were both famous for their love of jewels. Elizabeth Taylor was once married to Richard Burton. He famously bought her some of the world's most incredible gems. One was a 33-carat diamond ring. It was enormous, flawless. It was a statement. Taylor wore it everywhere. It became part of her identity. One evening, Princess Margaret and Elizabeth Taylor were at the same event. Margaret, known for her sharp wit and sometimes cutting remarks, saw the ring. Taylor, likely proud of the gift, held out her hand for the princess to see. Margaret looked at the massive diamond. She didn't gasp. She didn't compliment it. According to the story, she asked if she could try it on. Taylor agreed. The princess slipped the giant ring onto her own finger. She admired it for a moment. And then she looked at Elizabeth Taylor and said, "It's a very vulgar ring." She then took it off and handed it back. The insult was clear. It was a direct hit. It wasn't about the ring's quality. It was about taste. Margaret was implying that Taylor, the movie star, had new money taste. It was loud. It was showy. It was, in her royal opinion, vulgar. But the story doesn't end there. Elizabeth Taylor, never one to be outdone, had a quick reply. She looked at the princess and, with a smile, said, "Yes, ain't it great?" And then she suggested Margaret try on the Krupp diamond, an even larger stone she often wore. The exchange was a perfect little drama. Two queens, one royal and one Hollywood, sparring over a piece of jewelry. Margaret's comment was a classic move of the established elite. She used a subtle, dismissive word to put someone in their place. It wasn't a shout. It was a quiet jab, meant to remind Taylor of the difference in their status, but Taylor's response was just as powerful. She owned the insult. She turned vulgar into something fun and desirable. She refused to be shamed. It was a small moment, a few words exchanged at a party, but it was a clash of two worlds, the old world of inherited titles and understated elegance against the new world of Hollywood glamour and unapologetic extravagance. Princess Margaret's jab was petty, born from a position of assumed superiority. She was using her royal status to pass judgment. It was a way of saying, "You may have the money, but I have the class." It was a tiny power play, a way to feel superior for a fleeting moment. The fact that the story is still told today shows how a few well-chosen words can be more memorable than a grand declaration. Number 18, can you block a grandmother's photo? Queen Letizia of Spain was not born royal. She was a successful journalist and news anchor. When she married the future King Felipe VI, she entered a world with ancient rules and intense public scrutiny. Her mother-in-law, Queen Sophia, was born a princess of Greece and Denmark. She had been a queen consort for nearly 40 years. She understood the unspoken rules of royalty. Letizia was the modernizer. Sophia was the traditionalist. This was bound to create tension. The moment that showed this tension to the world happened on Easter Sunday in 2018. The Spanish royal family attended Mass at the Palma Cathedral in Mallorca. It was a public event. Cameras were everywhere. After the service, Queen Sophia stood near the church door. She put her arms around her two granddaughters, Princess Leonor and Infanta Sophia. She wanted a picture with them. It was a classic grandmotherly moment, a proud queen with the next generation of the monarchy. As a photographer prepared to take the picture, Queen Letizia walked in front of them. She stood directly between the camera and the trio of her mother-in-law and daughters. She seemed to be checking her daughter's hair. but she lingered, she blocked the shot. Queen Sophia appeared to say something to her. Letizia did not move. Princess Leonor, then 12, even tried to push her grandmother's hand away. The whole interaction was caught on video. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was incredibly awkward. It looked like a deliberate act of obstruction. The video went viral. People in Spain and around the world analyzed every frame. Was Letizia just being a protective mother? Or was she intentionally disrespecting her mother-in-law in public? The general feeling was that it was a power play. Letizia was controlling the image of her daughters. She was deciding who could take a picture with them and when. In the world of royalty, image is everything. Controlling the narrative is a constant battle. By physically blocking the photograph, Letizia was sending a clear message. She was in charge of her children. The pettiness of the act was in its public nature. This wasn't a private argument behind palace walls. This was a silent, physical confrontation played out in front of the world's media. It was a family squabble elevated to a national spectacle. A few days later, the family was photographed together again, appearing united. But the damage was done. The Easter photo incident revealed a crack in the facade of royal unity. It showed that even in a monarchy, family dynamics can be just as complicated and petty as in any other family. Letizia's move was a modern form of royal rivalry. It wasn't about jewels or titles, it was about control. Control over her children, control over her public image, and in that moment, control over her mother-in-law. It was a small act with big implications. Number 17, how long can you hold a grudge against a name? Elizabeth Bowyes-Lyon, later known as the Queen Mother, was the wife of King George VI. Wallis Simpson was the American woman for whom King Edward V gave up the throne. The abdication crisis of 1936 changed the course of British history. It also created one of the most enduring and bitter royal rivalries of the 20th century. And Elizabeth blamed Wallis for everything. She believed Wallis had led the king astray, forcing her own shy, stammering husband onto the throne, a role he never wanted. The stress, she believed, contributed to his early death. This was not a political disagreement, it was deeply personal. After the abdication, Edward was made the Duke of Windsor. He married Wallis. The royal family had to decide what to call her. The king, advised by his government and likely his wife, issued letters patent. These documents gave the Duke of Windsor the style of Royal Highness. But they specifically forbade his wife or any children from holding that same style. Wallis Simpson would be the Duchess of Windsor, but she would never be Her Royal Highness. To her and to the Duke, this was the ultimate insult. It was a constant public reminder that she was not accepted. As she was an outsider, this decision was championed and upheld for decades by the Queen Mother. She was the matriarch of the family. Her opinion carried immense weight. For the rest of their lives, the Duke and Duchess lived in exile. The Queen Mother reportedly referred to Wallis in private simply as that woman. She ensured Wallis was never fully integrated into the family. When the Duke of Windsor died in 1972, he was buried in the royal burial ground at Frogmore. The Queen, Elizabeth II, invited Wallis to stay at Buckingham Palace during the funeral. But even then, the old tensions were present. The Queen Mother's coldness was palpable. The pettiness was in the persistence. It wasn't a single act of revenge, it was a 50-year campaign of exclusion. The denial of the harsh title was a bureaucratic weapon. It was a formal, legal way to enforce a personal grudge. Every time an envelope was addressed, every time an introduction was made, the omission was there. It was a slight that never healed. The Queen Mother saw as protecting the sanctity of the monarchy. To her, Wallis represented a threat to the stability she and her husband had worked so hard to restore. But it was also a way to punish the woman she blamed for her husband's burdens and her own unexpected difficult life as queen consort. The Duke of Windsor pleaded for his wife to be given the title for his entire life. He saw it as a matter of respect for him. But the family, led by the quiet but firm will of the Queen Mother, never relented. Even after the Duke's death, Wallis remained simply the Duchess of Windsor. It was a victory of sorts for the Queen Mother, a cold, quiet, and extremely petty victory that lasted a lifetime. It showed that a simple title, just 3 letters, could be the focus of a decades-long war of attrition. Number 16 is Your Conversion to My Faith Good Enough? Queen Olga of Greece was a Russian Grand Duchess by birth. She was deeply devout in her Russian Orthodox faith. She married King George I of the Hellenes and became a beloved queen in Greece, known for her charity work. Her faith was central to her identity. When her son, Crown Prince Constantine, was set to marry, his chosen bride was Princess Sophie of Prussia. Sophie was a Protestant. This was a problem for the heir to the Greek throne. To marry a non-Orthodox princess was a major issue. Sophie, who was the sister of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, agreed to convert. This was a significant step. It meant leaving the faith of her family and her country to embrace the faith of her new home. She studied the Greek Orthodox Catechism. She was received into the church. She did everything that was required of her, but for Queen Olga, it was not enough. The conversion became the battleground for a quiet, persistent campaign of maternal disapproval. Olga watched Sophie like a hawk. She scrutinized her every move in church. She believed Sophie's conversion was not sincere. She thought it was a political convenience, not a true change of heart. She would criticize Sophie for not making the sign of the cross correctly. She would comment on her posture during services. She would question her understanding of the liturgy. It was a constant stream of pious nitpicking. Olga made her daughter-in-law feel like a spiritual failure. The rivalry was framed in the language of faith, but it was really a classic power struggle between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. Olga was the established queen, the matriarch, the guardian of Greek tradition and faith. Sophie was the newcomer, the foreigner, the one who had to prove herself. By constantly questioning Sophie's religious sincerity, Olga kept her off balance. She maintained her own position as the more devout, more authentic queen. This religious pettiness had real consequences. It created a tense and unhappy atmosphere within the royal family. It put Crown Prince Constantine in the difficult position of being caught between his mother and his wife. Sophie reportedly found the constant criticism deeply distressing. She had made a major life change, and instead of being welcomed, she was being judged. The situation became so tense that Sophie's brother, the Kaiser, became involved, further complicating the political situation between Germany and Greece. Queen Olga's actions were a form of psychological warfare disguised as religious devotion. It was a way to express her disapproval of her daughter-in-law without ever having to state it plainly. She wasn't arguing about politics or precedents. She was arguing about the state of Sophie's soul. It was an unassailable position. How could Sophie argue back? By saying she was devout enough? It was a subtle, clever, and deeply petty way for a queen to torment her rival. She turned the house of God into a theater for her own personal disapproval. Number 15, must an empress write to a mistress? Maria Theresa was the ruler of the Habsburg dominions. She was the Holy Roman Empress, the Archduchess of Austria, the Queen of Hungary and Bohemia. She was a sovereign in her own right, one of the most powerful women in the world. She was also a devout Catholic and a firm believer in the sanctity of marriage. In France, the power behind the throne was Madame de Pompadour. She was the official chief mistress of King Louis XV. She was not of noble birth, but her intelligence and charm made her the king's most trusted advisor. She wielded immense political power. During the mid-18th century, a major shift in European alliances was underway. Austria and France, longtime enemies, were considering an alliance against the rising power of Prussia. This was the diplomatic revolution. For this alliance to work, Maria Theresa needed to communicate with the French court. And in the French court, all roads led through Madame de Pompadour. This presented a huge problem for the empress. Maria Theresa was a monarch who ruled by divine right. Madame de Pompadour was, in her eyes, a woman of low birth living in sin with the king. The idea of writing to her directly, of treating her as an equal was unthinkable. It offended her both as a sovereign and as a pious wife. She refused. This was not just a personal feeling. It was a matter of protocol and status. An empress simply did not correspond with the king's mistress. This refusal could have destroyed the entire alliance. The French were insulted. Madame de Pompadour's position was being publicly slighted by the most powerful woman in Europe. But Maria Theresa would not budge. Her solution was a masterpiece of petty protocol. She would not write to Madame de Pompadour. Instead, she instructed her ministers to communicate with her. When a direct address was unavoidable, she wrote letters to her cousin, King Louis XV, and in them, she would send her regards to the Marquise de Pompadour. It was a tiny concession, but it maintained the distance she required. Eventually, as the alliance became more critical, Maria Theresa did write a short, formal note to Pompadour. She addressed her as Madame ma chère sœur et cousine, my dear sister and cousin, a standard form of address between monarchs, but a shocking one to use for a mistress. Some see this as a pragmatic move to secure the alliance. Others see it as the ultimate power play. By using the royal form of address, she wasn't elevating Pompadour. She was ironically pointing out the absurdity of the situation. It was a gesture that was both polite on the surface and deeply condescending underneath. The entire episode was a battle fought with stationery and titles. Maria Theresa's extreme snobbery was a political tool. By refusing to acknowledge Pompadour in the normal way, she was asserting her own moral and social superiority. She was making a statement about the proper order of the world. It was incredibly petty. The fate of nations and the balance of power in Europe hinged on whether an empress would deign to write a letter to a woman she considered her inferior. It was a reminder that even in the high-stakes world of international diplomacy, personal pride and prejudice can play a decisive role. Number 14, is it okay to take back your friend's palace keys? The Queen Anne of Great Britain and Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, were once the closest of friends. When Anne was a princess, Sarah was her lady of the bedchamber, her confidante, and her most trusted advisor. They used pet names for each other in their letters. Anne was Mrs. Morley, and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman. Their friendship was the foundation of Anne's political life. Sarah was intelligent, assertive, and politically ambitious. Anne was often indecisive and in poor health. For years, Sarah was the power behind the throne, but the friendship did not last. As Queen Anne grew tired of Sarah's domineering personality, Sarah was often blunt and critical. She tried to push the Queen to support her political party, the Whigs, at all costs. Anne began to seek advice from others, including her new, gentler favorite, Abigail Masham. Sarah saw Abigail as a rival and a traitor. The relationship between the Queen and the Duchess deteriorated into a series of bitter arguments and emotional confrontations. The final break was a slow and painful process marked by increasingly petty acts of retaliation. Sarah held several powerful and lucrative positions at court. One of the most important was Groom of the Stole, which gave her control over the Queen's household and privy purse. She was also Ranger of Windsor Great Park. These roles came with prestigious apartments at St. James's Palace. These apartments were not just a home, they were a symbol of her power and her closeness to the Queen. As their friendship crumbled, Queen Anne began to strip Sarah of her power, piece by piece. The ultimate act of petty revenge came in 1811. After a final, explosive argument, the Queen demanded that Sarah return her gold key, the symbol of her office as Groom of the Stole. Sarah resisted. She tried to delay. She wrote pleading, angry letters. Finally, her husband, the Duke of Marlborough, one of the country's greatest generals, had to persuade her to give it up. But Anne wasn't finished. Sarah had spent a great deal of her own money renovating her apartments at St. James's Palace. She expected to be able to stay in them for some time. The Queen had other ideas. She wanted Sarah out immediately. The Queen ordered that the Duchess's belongings be removed. When Sarah tried to take down the fixtures she had paid for, she was told she could not. The Queen, who had once been her dearest friend, was now evicting her like a common tenant. It was a humiliating public spectacle. The eviction was the culmination of years of resentment. For Queen Anne, it was about reclaiming her own authority. She was tired of being treated like a puppet by the Duchess. Forcing Sarah out of the palace apartment she had considered her own was a very visible way of saying, I am the Queen, and you are my subject. Our friendship is over. You know, it was a deeply personal slight disguised as an official act. It turned a symbol of their former intimacy, a shared living space at the heart of the court into a weapon of banishment. The fight between Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman was over, and the Queen had used the power of her office to have the last petty word. Number 13, must a queen obey her mother-in-law's fashion rules? Wilhelmina became Queen of the Netherlands when she was just 10 years old. Her mother, Queen Emma, served as regent until Wilhelmina turned 18. Emma was a German princess, deeply rooted in the formal, rigid etiquette of 19th century German courts. She raised her daughter with a strict sense of duty and protocol. When Wilhelmina came of age and took the throne in her own right, she was a serious, strong-willed young woman. She had her own ideas about how a modern monarch should behave. This set the stage for a long, simmering conflict with her mother. The power struggle between mother and daughter, between the old queen and the new, played out in the small details of court life. One of the main battlegrounds was fashion. Queen Emma believed in a very specific, conservative, and formal style of dress. Gowns were to be a certain length, gloves were always to be worn, the rules were complex and, in Wilhelmina's view, outdated. Wilhelmina wanted a more practical, modern style. She was the head of state, not just a decorative figure. She found her mother's constant advice and criticism on her wardrobe to be infantilizing. The pettiness came in the form of quiet rebellion. Wilhelmina would choose a dress she knew her mother would disapprove of. Emma would make a critical comment. Wilhelmina would ignore it. It was a silent war fought in the dressing room. According to stories from the Dutch court, the two women would have tense discussions about the appropriateness of an outfit for a particular occasion. Emma would insist on tradition. Wilhelmina would insist on her own judgment. This was not just about clothes. It was about autonomy. Wilhelmina had been under her mother's thumb for her entire childhood. Now that she was queen, she was determined to be her own person. Rejecting her mother's fashion advice was a way of asserting her independence. It was a way of saying, I am no longer a child you can dress up. I am the queen. Each dress choice was a small declaration of sovereignty. The conflict extended beyond fashion to all aspects of court protocol. Emma wanted the court to run on the old, formal lines she was used to. Wilhelmina found it stuffy and inefficient. She wanted to streamline things to make the monarchy more relevant to the 20th century. Every suggestion for change was met with resistance from her mother, who saw it as a rejection of her own legacy as regent. The relationship was a classic case of a new generation trying to break free from the old. For Wilhelmina, her mother was a constant reminder of a past she wanted to move beyond. The little acts of defiance, choosing the wrong hat, shortening a hemline, simplifying a court ceremony claims were her only weapons. They were petty, yes. They were the kind of disagreements that happen in many families. But in this family, the daughter was a queen, and her personal choices had public resonance. Her quiet fashion rebellion was a way to carve out her own identity, not just as a woman, but as a monarch, right under the critical eye of the queen who came before her. Number 12. Why make a high-ranking consort do a servant's work? Empress Dowager Cixi was one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. She was a consort of the Xianfeng Emperor. After his death, she became a regent for her young son, and later for her nephew, effectively controlling the Chinese government for nearly 50 years. She was brilliant, ruthless, and deeply conservative. She was a master of court politics. Her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, came to the throne as a child. As he grew up, he wanted to modernize China. Cixi resisted his reforms. Their relationship was a long, tense power struggle. The emperor had a favorite consort. Her name was Zhenfei, known as the Pearl Concubine. She was young, intelligent, and spirited. She supported the emperor's desire for reform. She learned to speak English. She was interested in the art of photography, which was new and foreign. She encouraged the emperor to stand up to his powerful aunt, the Empress Dowager. Cixi saw the Pearl Concubine not just as a rival for the emperor's affection, but as a dangerous political influence. She represented everything Cixi feared: foreign ideas, reform, and a challenge to her own authority. Cixi decided to humiliate the Pearl Concubine. She used her absolute power within the Forbidden City to crush her rival's spirit. She couldn't simply get rid of her, not at first. The emperor loved her. So Cixi resorted to petty, degrading punishments. She accused the Pearl Concubine of meddling in politics. She stripped her of her rank, and she subjected her to public beatings, a terrible disgrace for a high-ranking woman. But Perhaps the pettiest punishment was forcing her to perform the work of a low-level servant. The pearl concubine, who was used to a life of privilege and refinement, was reportedly made to do menial tasks. She was forced to grind ink or carry water. These were not difficult jobs, but they were deeply humiliating. In the rigid hierarchy of the imperial court, every role was precisely defined. To force a consort to do the work of a servant was a powerful and public statement of her disgrace. It was a way for Cixi to show everyone in the palace, including the emperor, who was truly in charge. The emperor was powerless to stop it. He could only watch as the woman he loved was systematically degraded by the woman he was forced to obey. Cixi's cruelty was calculated. She wasn't just punishing the pearl concubine, she was punishing the emperor. She was showing him the consequences of defying her. Every menial task the pearl concubine was forced to perform was a message to him about his own weakness. The story had a tragic end. During the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, as the imperial court fled Beijing, Cixi ordered that the pearl concubine be thrown down a well. But long before that final, brutal act, Cixi had used years of petty cruelty to make her rival's life a misery. The forced servitude was a particularly nasty form of psychological torment. It was a daily reminder of her fall from grace, a slow, grinding humiliation designed to break her spirit and serve as a warning to anyone else who dared to challenge the will of the Empress Dowager. Number 11. Could you befriend your husband's mistress to control him? Caroline of Ansbach was the wife of King George II of Great Britain. She was one of the most intelligent and politically astute queen consorts in British history. Her husband, George, was not her intellectual equal. He was hot-tempered, stubborn, and had a wandering eye. Throughout their marriage, he had a series of mistresses. In the 18th century court, this was not unusual. A royal wife was expected to tolerate her husband's infidelities with quiet dignity. Caroline did more than tolerate them. She managed them. Her primary rival was not another queen, but the succession of women her husband took as lovers. Instead of fighting them, alienating them, or, trying to have them banished from court, Caroline chose a radically different strategy. She befriended them. Her most famous rival was Henrietta Howard, later the Countess of Suffolk. Henrietta was one of the king's longest serving mistresses. She was also one of Queen Caroline's ladies of the bedchamber. This created a bizarre and very public arrangement. The queen's official attendant was also the king's official mistress. Caroline did not treat Henrietta as a rival. She treated her as a colleague. They would spend hours together talking, playing cards, and attending to the queen's needs. Caroline would often use Henrietta as a channel to the king. She knew her husband's moods and habits. She knew that he would often listen to his mistress when he would not listen to his wife or his ministers. So Caroline would give Henrietta subtle instructions. She would tell her what to say to the king, how to guide him towards a particular political decision, or how to soothe his famous temper. The queen was essentially using her rival as a tool to manage her husband and, by extension, to influence the government. It was a brilliant, pragmatic, and, in its own way, deeply petty strategy. She was co-opting her rival's power for her own ends. This arrangement was confusing to many at court. They couldn't understand why the queen was so friendly with the woman who shared her husband's bed. But Caroline understood power. She knew that an open war with the king's mistress would be messy, and she would likely lose. The king would resent her for it. By keeping Henrietta close, she neutralized her as a threat. Henrietta was never able to build her own political faction or challenge the queen's influence because the queen had already made her an ally. Caroline's approach was a form of supreme confidence. She was so secure in her own intellectual superiority and her emotional hold over the king that she did not see other women as a true threat. They were a necessary nuisance, and a nuisance that could be put to good use. She treated them with a kind of polite, condescending kindness. She was the manager of the entire royal enterprise, and the mistresses were just part of the staff. It was a subtle, psychological game. She got her revenge not by being cruel, but by being indispensable. She made sure that even the king's infidelity ultimately served her own political purposes. It was the ultimate power move, turning a personal betrayal into a professional advantage. Number 10. Can you erase a queen from history? Hatshepsut was one of the most powerful women of the ancient world. She was not a queen consort. She was a pharaoh of Egypt. She ruled for over 20 years in the 15th century BC. Her reign was a time of peace, prosperity, and great building projects. She was a successful ruler, but she was a woman in a man's role. To legitimize her rule, she was often depicted in statues and carvings with male attributes, including a false beard. Her path to power was complicated. She was the daughter of one pharaoh and the wife of another, her half-brother Thutmose II. When he died, the heir was his young son, Thutmose III, born to a lesser wife. Hatshepsut was supposed to be the regent, ruling only until her stepson was old enough to take the throne. But Hatshepsut had other plans. A few years into her regency, she had herself crowned pharaoh. She became the senior ruler. Thutmose III was pushed into the background. For 2 decades, he lived in the shadow of his powerful stepmother. We don't know the details of their personal relationship. We don't know if he resented her, feared her, or respected her. But we know what happened after she died. Thutmose III finally became the sole pharaoh. He proved to be a great military leader, often called the Napoleon of Egypt. For the first 20 years of his reign, he did nothing to his stepmother's memory. Her temple stood. Her statues remained. Her name was visible on monuments throughout Egypt. Then, late in his reign, something changed. Thutmose III ordered a systematic campaign to erase Hatshepsut from history. It was a thorough and ruthless act of posthumous revenge. Workers were sent all over Egypt with chisels and hammers. They went to her magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahri. They went to the temple at Karnak. Everywhere her image appeared, it was hacked away. Her statues were smashed and thrown into pits. Her name, written in cartouches, was chiseled out of the stone walls and replaced with the name of her father, her husband, or Thutmose III himself. The goal was to pretend she had never existed. The official king lists were changed to show Thutmose III succeeding his father directly. It was an attempt to literally rewrite history. Why did he do it? And why did he wait 20 years? Historians have debated this for a long time. It probably wasn't personal hatred. After 20 years, any personal anger would likely have faded. The most likely reason was political. Thutmose III wanted to ensure a smooth succession for his own son. The idea of a woman ruling as pharaoh was a disruption to the traditional order. By erasing Hatshepsut, he was erasing a dangerous precedent. He was restoring the idea that only a man could be a king. But the act itself was incredibly petty. It was a silent, violent conversation with a dead woman. It was the ultimate act of disrespect. He couldn't defeat her when she was alive, so he tried to destroy her in death. It was a massive, state-sponsored project of spite. Despite his efforts, he failed. Archaeologists have been able to piece together the smashed statues and read the faint outlines of the chiseled-out names. In a strange twist of fate, the very act of trying to erase her has made her one of the most famous figures in ancient Egyptian history. The attempt to make her forgotten has ensured she will always be remembered. Number 9. What if? A queen hates the rules. So much she builds her own world. Marie Antoinette arrived at the French court at Versailles as a 14-year-old girl. She was an Austrian archduchess sent to marry the future Louis XVI to seal a political alliance. The court of Versailles was the most magnificent and the most rigid in Europe. It was governed by a complex and ancient system of etiquette. There was a rule for everything: how a queen should wake up, how she should get dressed, who could hand her the chemise, who could sit on a stool in her presence. It was a life lived in public, a constant performance. Marie Antoinette hated it. She found the rules suffocating and ridiculous. She came from a more relaxed court in Vienna. She was young, lively, and informal by nature. The endless ceremony of Versailles felt like a prison. Her disapproval of the court etiquette was a constant source of friction. She would often break the rules, intentionally or not. She preferred to choose her own friends based on personal affection, not their noble rank. This offended the old, powerful aristocratic families who believed they had a right to be in the queen's circle. Her rebellion against etiquette became a form of passive-aggressive warfare against the court itself. But her most famous and most controversial act of defiance was the creation of her own private retreat, the Petit Trianon. This was a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles that the king gave her as a gift. She transformed it and the surrounding park into her personal kingdom. It was here that she could escape the pressures of the main palace. At the Petit Trianon, the strict etiquette of Versailles was abolished. The queen could be herself. She dressed in simple muslin dresses, which were seen as shocking and inappropriate for a queen who was supposed to display the wealth of the nation through her luxurious attire. She created a fantasy world, a Hamo or Hamlet, which was a picturesque, idealized version of a peasant village. It had a farmhouse, a dairy, and a mill. The queen and her friends would dress up as shepherdesses and milkmaids. To the queen, this was an innocent escape. It was a way to find some privacy and simplicity in her unnatural life. But to the French people and the resentful aristocracy, it looked incredibly frivolous and out of touch. While real peasants were starving, the queen was playing at being a peasant in a multi-million livre theme park. The Petit Trianon became a symbol of her extravagance and her detachment from her duties. Her insistence on privacy was also a major breach of protocol. The life of a queen was supposed to be public. People had the right to see her. But at the Petit Trianon, entry was by invitation only. Even the king was not always welcome. She surrounded herself with a small circle of favorites, shutting out the rest of the court. This created immense jealousy and resentment. It was seen as a deliberate snub. The creation of the Petit Trianon was a deeply personal act, but it had huge political consequences. It was her petty revenge against a system she despised. She couldn't change the rules of Versailles, so she built a place where those rules didn't apply. But in doing so, she isolated herself, she fueled the rumors and the hatred that would eventually contribute to her downfall. Her desire for a simple life, expressed through the ultimate luxury, became one of the most powerful arguments against her. Number 8. Can you steal your own grandchildren? Catherine the Great of Russia was an absolute monarch. She had seized the throne from her own husband, Peter III, and ruled as empress for over 30 years. She was a woman of immense intelligence, ambition, and energy. She also had a very difficult relationship with her son and heir, Paul. She had never been close to him. She found him to be neurotic, unstable, and ill-suited to rule. She had kept him away from power for his entire adult life. When Paul finally married for the second time to a German princess named Sophie Dorothea of Württemberg, who took the name Maria Feodorovna, Catherine was initially pleased. She needed heirs to secure the Romanov dynasty. When Maria gave birth to her first son, Alexander, in 1777, Catherine was overjoyed. But her joy took a form that was terrifying for the new parents. Catherine decided that she, and she alone, would raise the child. Immediately after the birth, Catherine swept into the room, took the baby from his mother, and carried him off to her own apartments. Paul and Maria were effectively forbidden from raising their own child. Catherine had prepared a suite of rooms for the new prince right next to her own. She hired the nurses, the tutors, and the doctors. She dictated every aspect of his upbringing, from what he ate to what he read. She wrote a detailed instruction manual for his education based on the progressive ideas of the Enlightenment. The parents were allowed to see their son only occasionally, for short, formal visits. Maria Feodorovna was heartbroken. She had longed for a child, and now he had been taken from her. Paul was furious, but he was powerless. His mother was the empress. Her will was law. When their second son, Constantine, was born, the same thing happened. Catherine took him too. This was not an act of love. It was an act of power and control. It was also incredibly petty. Catherine was essentially telling her son and daughter-in-law that they were incompetent. She didn't trust them to raise the future rulers of Russia. By taking their children, she was bypassing her own son. She was grooming her grandson, Alexander, to be her successor, hoping to cut Paul out of the line of succession entirely. The act was a constant, daily humiliation for Paul and Maria. They lived in the same palace as their children, but they were strangers to them. The boys grew up seeing their grandmother as the center of their universe and their parents as distant, unimportant figures. This created a deeply dysfunctional family dynamic that would have consequences for generations. Catherine's theft of her grandchildren was a cold and calculated move. She was using the babies as pawns in her long-running political and personal battle with her son. She was asserting her absolute authority in the most intimate way possible. She was denying her son the one thing that should have been his by right, his own family. It was a petty act of domestic tyranny carried out on an imperial scale, a cruel reminder to Paul that as long as his mother was alive, he would never truly be a man, a father, or a ruler. Number 7. How do you insult an entire class of people with a single friendship? Queen Victoria reigned for 63 years. After her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she was plunged into a deep depression. She withdrew from public life and wore black for the rest of her life. Her extended mourning exasperated her ministers and the public. She lived in seclusion, primarily at Windsor, Balmoral in Scotland, or Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. During this period of intense grief, she came to rely on one person more than anyone else, a Scottish servant named John Brown. John Brown was a gillie, an outdoor servant from Balmoral. He was rugged, plain-spoken, and had no time for courtly manners. He treated the queen not as a monarch, but as a woman who needed help. He was not afraid to tell her what to do. He would order her to go on her daily carriage ride for her health, even when she didn't want to. He spoke to her with a frankness that no one else dared to use. And Victoria, who was tired of the fawning and scraping of her courtiers, found his honesty refreshing. She grew incredibly dependent on him. Their relationship became the scandal of the age. Brown was given immense privileges. He had his own rooms, his own servant, and a great deal of influence over the queen's life. He controlled access to her. He would pass on messages from her ministers. The Queen's own children, the Prince of Wales included, had to go through John Brown to speak to their mother. The aristocracy and the government were horrified. They saw Brown as a coarse, uneducated servant who had far too much power. They whispered that the Queen had lost her mind. Rumors, almost certainly untrue, circulated that they were secretly married. She was mockingly called Mrs. Brown. The Queen did not care. In fact, she seemed to revel in the disapproval. Her elevation of John Brown was a petty act of revenge against the very people who were trying to push her back into public life. She was tired of her ministers like Prime Minister Gladstone, whom she detested. She was tired of the demands of her role. She was tired of the empty rituals of the court. By making a Highland gillie her most trusted companion, she was sending a clear message to the establishment: your opinions do not matter to me. I will do as I please. She commissioned portraits of him. She gave him medals. She published a book, Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, which was full of praise for him. It was a public declaration of their friendship. Every honor she gave him was a snub to the dukes and earls who felt they, by birthright, should be the Queen's advisors. It was a way of inverting the rigid social hierarchy of the Victorian era. She was placing a servant above princes. When John Brown died, the Queen was devastated. She ordered a grand funeral and wrote a biography of him, which her private secretary had to beg her not to publish. She had statues and memorials to him erected at all her homes. Her lifelong devotion to the memory of a servant was a final act of defiance. It was a petty war fought against the expectations of her class. By loving John Brown, whether as a friend or something more, she found a way to rebel against the gilded cage of her own monarchy. Number 6, can a mother use her own son to start a war? Isabella of France was the wife of King Edward II of England. Their marriage was a disaster. Edward II was a weak king who was notoriously dependent on his male favorites. His first favorite was Piers Gaveston. After Gaveston was executed by angry nobles, the king eventually found a new one, Hugh Despencer the Younger. This Despencer and his father became the real rulers of England. They were greedy, ambitious, and ruthless. They alienated the queen and the rest of the nobility. Isabella, who was a smart and capable woman, was publicly humiliated and pushed aside. The Despensers saw Isabella as a threat. They reduced her household staff. They confiscated her lands and her money. At one point, they even took her children away from her. Isabella was trapped. She was a foreign princess in a hostile court, powerless against her husband's favorites. She needed a way out. Her chance came in 1325. There was a dispute between England and France over territory. Isabella, who was the sister of the French king, Charles IV, offered to go to France to negotiate a peace treaty. Edward II and the Despensers, likely happy to be rid of her, agreed. Isabella went to Paris, but she wasn't just there to negotiate. She was there to plot. The treaty required that the heir to the English throne, the young Prince Edward, the future Edward III, come to France to pay homage to the French king for his lands in France. King Edward II was reluctant to let his son go, fearing he would become a pawn, but Isabella insisted. It was the only way to secure the peace. Finally, the king agreed. The young prince was sent to join his mother in Paris. This was the moment Isabella had been waiting for. Once her son was safely with her, on French soil and out of the Despensers' reach, she showed her true intentions. She refused to come back to England. She declared that she would not set foot in the kingdom again as long as the Despensers were in power. She had, in effect, kidnapped the heir to the throne. Right? Like, this was an audacious and incredibly risky move. She used her own son as a political weapon. With Prince Edward at her side, she was no longer just a disgruntled wife. She was the leader of a rival court, a rallying point for all the English nobles who hated the Despensers. She began to gather an army, funded by her brother and other allies. Her defiance was a public declaration of war against her husband and his favorites. And her refusal to return was a calculated act of political theater. It was also deeply personal and petty. For years, the Despensers had taken everything from her dignity, her income, her children. Now, she had taken the most important thing from them, the future king. She used the excuse of a diplomatic mission to orchestrate her revenge. By luring her son to France, she gained the legitimacy she needed to launch an invasion. In 1326, she and her ally, Roger Mortimer, landed in England with a small army. The country rose up to support her. The Despensers were captured and executed. King Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son. Isabella, the she-wolf of France, had won. Her victory began with the petty, defiant act of a queen who went on a trip and simply refused to come home. Number 5, can you win a war with jewels? And a slogan. The great matter of King Henry V was his desperate quest to annul his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry Anne Boleyn. Catherine had been Queen of England for over 20 years. She was a Spanish princess, a devout Catholic, and a popular queen. Anne Boleyn was a lady in waiting, stylish, witty, and ambitious. The conflict between the two women was not just a personal rivalry for a man's affection. It was a struggle for the crown of England itself, and it would change the course of religious history. As Henry's legal case to annul his marriage dragged on, the court became a tense and divided place. You were either for Queen Catherine or for the Lady Anne. The two women fought a cold war, using symbols, status, and protocol as their weapons. One of the main battlegrounds was jewelry. The crown jewels belonged to the queen. Catherine, as queen, had possession of them. As Anne's star rose, Henry began to pressure Catherine to give up some of the jewels for Anne to wear. This was a deep insult. The jewels were not just ornaments, they were a symbol of queenship. For Anne, a mere lady in waiting, to wear them was a public statement that she was the queen in waiting. Catherine refused. She held on to the jewels as a symbol of her rightful status, but Henry was the king. He eventually forced her to surrender some pieces. When Anne appeared at court functions wearing jewels that had once belonged to Catherine, it was a deliberate act of provocation. It was a way of saying, I have taken your husband, and I am taking your crown. Every gemstone was a little victory for Anne and a little humiliation for Catherine. Another weapon in their petty war was mottos or slogans. Both women and their supporters adopted phrases to signal their allegiance. Catherine's motto was humble and loyal. It was a statement of her piety and her unwavering belief in her status as Henry's true wife and queen. It was a dignified and passive-aggressive slogan. Anne, on the other hand, chose the motto, the most happy. Later she changed it to, grumble all you like, this is how it's gonna be. This was a bold and defiant statement. It was a direct taunt to Catherine and her supporters. It was a declaration of victory before the battle was even officially over. The court was filled with these little acts of war. A supporter of Anne might wear a piece of jewelry with her initials. A supporter of Catherine might pointedly refuse to give Anne the precedence she expected. When Henry finally broke with the Catholic Church, married Anne, and had her crowned queen, the war escalated. Anne insisted that Catherine's daughter, Mary, acknowledge her as queen and as her stepmother. Mary, fiercely loyal to her own mother, refused. She was declared illegitimate, and her household was broken up. She was forced to serve as a lady in waiting to her own infant half-sister, Elizabeth, Anne's daughter. This was the ultimate act of petty cruelty orchestrated by Anne and the king. Forcing a princess to serve her own baby sister was a profound humiliation designed to break her spirit and force her to accept the new order. The rivalry between Catherine and Anne was fought on a grand scale, changing the religion of a nation. But it was also fought in the tiniest details. The ownership of a necklace, the choice of a motto, the forced servitude of a child. These small, spiteful acts were the daily reality of their epic struggle. Number 4, how do you evict your rival from her dream home? Diane de Poitiers was the great love of King Henry II of France. She was 20 years older than him, but she was beautiful, intelligent, and she captivated him completely. Their relationship began when he was just a boy. For his entire reign, she was his most trusted advisor and the most powerful woman in France. The actual queen, Catherine de' Medici, was left in the shadows. Catherine was the same age as the king. She had come from Italy to marry him as a teenager. For the first 10 years of their marriage, she failed to produce an heir, and her position was insecure. She had to watch as her husband openly adored his mistress. The king showered Diane with gifts. He gave her titles and land. But the greatest gift of all was the Château de Chenonceau. This was a beautiful and unique castle built over the River Cher. It was a jewel of Renaissance architecture. Henry gave it to Diane, and she poured her heart and a great deal of money into it. She commissioned a famous architect to build a bridge connecting the chateau to the opposite bank of the river. She created magnificent gardens. Chenonceau was her masterpiece. It was a symbol of her power and the king's love for her. Catherine de' Medici hated it. She hated Diane and she coveted Chenonceau. For years, she had to endure the humiliation of seeing her rival living in splendor in the most beautiful castle in France, a castle that Catherine felt should have been hers. She could do nothing about it. As long as the king was alive, Diane was untouchable. Then, in 1559, King Henry II died in a jousting accident. Catherine de' Medici, who had been a powerless wife for over 25 years, was suddenly the regent for her young son, the new king. She finally had power, and her first act was revenge. It was a swift, cold, and perfectly legal act of petty vengeance. Almost immediately after the king's death, Catherine invited Diane to exchange chateaux. She forced Diane to give up the magnificent Chenonceau. In return, she gave Diane a different castle, the Château de Chaumont. Chaumont was a fine castle. It was a large medieval fortress. But it was not Chenonceau. It was older, more forbidding, and lacked the elegance and beauty of Diane's creation. The exchange was a public humiliation. Catherine was not just taking a piece of property, she was stripping Diane of the most visible symbol of her reign as the king's mistress. She was evicting her from her home, a home filled with memories of the king. It was a way of erasing Diane's legacy. Catherine then took possession of Chenonceau and began to make it her own. She hosted lavish parties there. And in a final act of one-upmanship, she built a grand two-story gallery on top of the very bridge that Diane had built. Catherine's addition was bigger and more extravagant. It was an architectural statement that said, this place is mine now, and I will make it even grander than you did. The story of Chenonceau is a perfect example of revenge through real estate. Catherine had waited patiently for decades. She had swallowed her pride and endured her husband's infidelity, but she never forgot. The moment she had the power, she used it to take the one thing her rival loved most. It wasn't a violent revenge, it was a quiet, bureaucratic transaction. But for Diane de Poitiers, losing Chenonceau was the ultimate defeat. Number 3, can a queen's height and dress sense be a political weapon? The rivalry between Queen Elizabeth I of England and Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of the defining conflicts of the 16th century. They were cousins, they were both queens, and they were both rivals for the same throne. Mary had a strong claim to the English throne, and many English Catholics believed she was the rightful queen, not the Protestant Elizabeth. For nearly 20 years, Mary was Elizabeth's prisoner in England. But even before that, when Mary was Queen of France and then Scotland, they were locked in a long-distance battle of wits and diplomacy. Because they never met in person, their rivalry played out in letters, through spies, and in the reports of their ambassadors. They were intensely curious about each other. They would constantly ask their envoys for physical descriptions. This led to one of the pettiest and most revealing episodes in their relationship. Mary was famously tall for a woman of her time, perhaps close to 6 feet. She was also widely considered a great beauty. Elizabeth was of average height and, while striking, was not a conventional beauty. She was acutely sensitive about her appearance. In 1564, Elizabeth's ambassador to Scotland, Sir James Melville, had an audience with her after returning from Mary's court. And Elizabeth grilled him for details. She wanted to know everything about her cousin. Then, she got to the heart of the matter. She asked him who was taller, her or Mary. Melville, a shrewd diplomat, tried to be tactful and said Mary was taller. Elizabeth's response was sharp. Then she is too high, for I myself am of a just stature. The questioning continued. Elizabeth wanted to know who had fairer hair, who was more skilled at playing music, who danced better. It was like a scene out of a high school rivalry. The Queen of England, one of the most powerful rulers in the world, was insecure and wanted to be reassured that she was better than her rival. This obsession with appearance also played out in their choice of clothing. Both queens understood that in the 16th century, dress was a powerful form of political communication. It displayed wealth, status, and intent. Elizabeth was a master of royal fashion. She used her magnificent wardrobe to create an image of power and majesty, the virgin queen married to her kingdom. Her portraits are filled with enormous ruffs, gowns covered in jewels, and rich fabrics. When Mary was a prisoner in England, she used her clothing to send subtle messages of defiance. Even in captivity, she insisted on being dressed as a queen. Her clothes were often black and white, the colors of her rival, Catherine de' Medici, from her time in France, but also colors that asserted a regal and somber dignity. She also used embroidery. She would sew elaborate panels with hidden symbols and mottos, often asserting her claim to the English throne or alluding to her unjust imprisonment. It was a quiet, coded rebellion. The most famous fashion confrontation came after Mary was executed. Elizabeth ordered the execution, but she always claimed she had been reluctant. On the day of her death, Mary came to the scaffold wearing a dress of black velvet. But underneath, she wore a chemise and petticoat of deep crimson, the liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom. When the executioner removed her outer garments, the sudden reveal of the blood-red clothing was a shocking and deliberate final statement. It was her last act of political theater, turning her death into a powerful symbol for her Catholic supporters. Even in their final encounter, the war of appearances continued. The two queens, who never met, fought a long, petty, and deadly war using height, hair color, and the fabric of their gowns as their weapons. Number 2, can you forbid a woman from court for the rest of her life? And Queen Elizabeth, I famously never married. She cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, married only to her country. But there was one man who was widely believed to be the love of her life, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. They had been friends since childhood. He was handsome, charming, and ambitious. For years, the court buzzed with rumors that the Queen would marry him. But Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, died in a mysterious fall down a flight of stairs. The scandal made it impossible for the Queen to marry him, even if she had wanted to. Dudley remained the Queen's favorite. He was always at her side. He held great power at court. But he also knew the Queen would likely never marry him. He needed an heir to carry on his name and titles, so secretly he married again. His bride was a woman named Lettice Knollys. Lettice was not just any courtier. She was the Queen's first cousin once removed. And she looked remarkably like the Queen, with the same red gold hair and pale complexion. She was also a widow, and she was known for her beauty and spirit. The marriage was a secret for a reason. They both knew the queen would be furious. Elizabeth was a famously jealous woman, especially when it came to her favorites. She expected absolute devotion from the men in her inner circle. For Dudley, the man she loved, to marry someone else was a deep personal betrayal. And for him to marry her own cousin, a woman who looked like a younger version of herself, was an unbearable insult. The secret eventually came out. The French ambassador of all people informed the queen of the marriage, and her reaction was explosive. She was enraged. She felt she had been deceived by the two people closest to her. She reportedly boxed Dudley's ears and screamed at him. She called Letty's a she-wolf and a flouting wench. Her revenge was not swift and violent. It was cold, persistent, and incredibly petty. She banished Lettice Knollys from court forever. This was not a temporary punishment. It was a life sentence for the rest of Queen Elizabeth's long reign, which lasted more than 2 decades after the marriage. Lettice was never again allowed to come into the Queen's presence. To be banished from court was a social and political death sentence for an aristocrat in the 16th century. It cut you off from the center of power, patronage, and society. Lettice tried everything to get back into the Queen's good graces. She wrote pleading letters. She had powerful friends intercede on her behalf. Her husband Dudley begged the Queen to forgive her. At one point, years later, Dudley arranged for a supposed chance encounter at a hunting lodge, hoping that if the Queen just saw Lettice, she might relent. The Queen found out and was furious at the trick. The banishment held firm. Even after Robert Dudley died, the Queen did not forgive Lettice. She had loved him, but she would never forgive the woman who had, in her eyes, stolen him from her. The lifelong banishment of Lettice Knollys was a testament to the depth of the Queen's jealousy. It was a petty act magnified by the absolute power of a monarch. For the crime of marrying the man the Queen loved, Lettice was made a non-person. Elizabeth couldn't have Dudley, but she could make sure that the woman who did was punished for the rest of her life. Number 1, what is the ultimate revenge of a jailed wife? Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, a vast and wealthy territory in France. First, she was Queen of France, married to King Louis VII. That marriage was annulled. Then, she married Henry of Anjou, who soon became King Henry II of England. She was then Queen of England. Together, they had 8 children, including 5 sons. Theirs was a passionate and stormy relationship. They were a power couple who ruled a vast empire, but their marriage eventually fell apart. Henry II was a brilliant and energetic king, but he was also famously unfaithful. His most famous mistress was Rosamund Clifford, the Fair Rosamund. Eleanor, who was a powerful duchess and a queen, was not the type of woman to tolerate such insults quietly. The tension between them grew. Eleanor left the English court and set up her own court in her native Aquitaine. It became a famous center of culture, poetry, and courtly love. The final break came in 1173. Eleanor did something shocking. She encouraged her 3 eldest sons, Henry the Young King, Richard the future Lionheart, and Geoffrey, to rebel against their own father, King Henry II. This was the Great Revolt. It was a massive betrayal. Eleanor, the king's wife and queen, was the driving force behind a war led by his own children. The revolt was ultimately a failure. The sons were defeated and forced to submit to their father, but Henry II's revenge against his wife was severe. He captured Eleanor and placed her under house arrest. For the next 16 years, she was a prisoner. She was moved from castle to castle in England, kept under guard, and stripped of all her power. Her husband, the man she had made a king, had jailed her. This was the ultimate humiliation for a woman who had once been one of the most powerful people in Europe. For 16 long years, Eleanor waited. She outlived her husband's mistress, Rosamund. She outlived 2 of her rebel sons. She waited while her favorite son, Richard, grew into a formidable warrior. Then, in 1189, King Henry II died. Eleanor's imprisonment was over. She was nearly 70 years old, an age when most people were long retired from public life. But like Eleanor was just getting started. Her revenge was not a single petty act. It was her entire second act in life. She emerged from prison and immediately took control. Her son, Richard the Lionheart, became king, but he spent most of his reign away on crusade or fighting wars in France. In his absence, Eleanor ruled England. She was the regent, the power behind the throne. She governed with skill and authority. She put the kingdom's finances in order. She dealt with rebellions, including one by her own youngest son, John. When Richard was captured and held for ransom on his way back from the crusade, it was Eleanor who raised the enormous sum of money to free him. Her ultimate revenge on her dead husband was to be a better ruler than he ever was in his final troubled years. She had been his prisoner, but she outlasted him. She secured the throne for their son Richard, the son who had joined her in rebellion. And after Richard's death, she worked to secure the throne for her youngest son John. She traveled across Europe as an elderly woman, conducting diplomacy and arranging marriages. She lived to be over 80 years old, active and powerful to the very end. Her revenge was not in a spiteful word or a single act of cruelty. Her revenge was in living, in enduring, and in ultimately triumphing. She took the kingdom that had been her prison, and she ruled it. She ensured that the legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty was secured, not by the will of her unfaithful husband, but by her own strength and intelligence. She had the last laugh, and it was a laugh that echoed through the rest of the century. Her survival and her subsequent reign was the ultimate, most profound, and least petty form of getting back at the rival who had wronged her most, the king who had been her husband.